Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again. Thank you very much, Samita, for inviting me, the IPAM group, and for everyone for welcoming me into this community. Because even though I am at the Technical University of Eindhoven, I am more on the social science and humanities side. So I'm in the Technology, Innovation and Society group, where we look more at the interaction between society and technologies. And this talk takes a mobility perspective that considers how technologies, users, and the social context together shape the way people, things, and data move, or not. It takes a social justice perspective to understand how inequalities play out with regards to emerging and future mobility systems. And rather than the kind of very detailed work that we've seen in many of the presentations yesterday, this will be more of a bigger picture thinking piece, I think. I'll start off with some more conceptual work, followed by 2 case studies, so you can take a bit of a rest, that illustrate the conceptual work, and then a conclusion that opens up for discussion on how to link this mobility justice perspective with more of the transport equity approaches that most of you are engaged with. And I look forward on your thoughts on these potential links. But first, it's early in the morning, you just had breakfast and coffee, so let's get everyone on board with this talk. A little warm-up question. Let's think about electric cars, widely proposed as a key solution in the transition to more sustainable mobility. What kind of questions or challenges come to your mind when you think about electric cars? Anyone already awake?
Range anxiety.
Range anxiety, totally.
Moving pollution from where cars are to where the electricity is produced.
Yeah, nice. We're moving pollutions away from the tailpipe to where it's generated.
Doesn't solve the traffic problem.
Doesn't solve the traffic problem, absolutely. I was also hoping someone might say how to calculate the amount of carbon they're able to save, how to adjust financial incentives to make uptake more equitable, or someone might think about how to optimize the use of car batteries for storage of peak renewable energy, or how to redistribute fleets of shared or autonomous electric cars in equitable ways. How lessons from e-mobility frontrunners can be scaled up. All important and fascinating questions. I'd like to add here what comes to mind for me when I think about electric cars to get started with mobility justice thinking. Which parts of our societies and which societies benefit most from electric cars and why? How is the mobility of local communities in the lithium triangle restricted by intimidation through mining companies? How does the water scarcity associated with lithium mining lead to increased migration? How do our cities and societies stay car dependent by focusing their mobility transition on electric cars? These questions are broadly reflective of mobility justice approaches. I hope they get us kind of started to think about this topic. If you're interested to go a little bit deeper into this, my colleague Henderson wrote a paper titled "EVs Are Not the Answer, a Mobility Justice Critique of Electric Vehicle Transitions." And I recommend it as a nice way to get into these kinds of discussions around electric cars. And Henderson's work, and also mine, draws principally on Mimi Scheller's seminal work on mobility justice. So the book Mobility Justice, The Politics of Movement in an Age of Extremes came out a few years ago. And when it first came out, I really liked how this mobility justice approach provides some bigger picture thinking that allows us to challenge how to research transport and mobility. So Sheller says, mobility justice is an overarching concept for thinking about how power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, resources, and information. And it pays attention to multiple scales and dimensions of justice and injustice. Now, when mobility justice scholarship took off, including Scheller's work, I had just completed leading some research on smart cycling. And the Smart e-bike project came about while I was still a postdoc in digital society and not a transport researcher at all. I was invited to be part of this interdisciplinary boot camp, a little bit like this workshop, but for 1 week in a countryside hotel, and at the end you can get research funding if you come up with a good project and form a nice team. That was my first contact with the world of transportation research. But all the projects that came up weren't really dealing with anything to do with digital society or datafication of transport. And certainly nobody was thinking about cycling. So I was a little bit disappointed, went to the pub at night and moaned about this. Luckily, there were a couple of other people in the pub that felt kind of similar. So we came up with this project. Had 2 days to go and 1 night and managed to get the funding. So I'm all in for interdisciplinary workshops and meetings. And from that on, I really learned more about transportation research. So we had a bunch of these electrically assisted e-bikes, 35 of them. We did some electronics engineering to put a monitoring system on them so we could see how people were using them, gave them out to people to see if they would give up car journeys to get to work by cycling. And wonderfully, yes, 20% reduction of car driving. And we also got a lot of information of how cycling could be a sort of hybrid digital physical experience for the people involved. So I was slowly making my way into the world of transportation, and I came across the mobility work and the mobility justice work, but I also came very much from a digital background of studying digital society and how we experience the world around us when everything becomes more datafied. So I was also very much aware of work that happens in critical data studies and around data justice. That is very much not about transportation. So this is really about fairness in the way people are made visible, represented, and treated as a result of their production of digital data. Most of you are probably dealing with data in your work in some shape or form, but this is really a field that thinks more about the implications that has for society and for people's experiences. And it is another group of people thinks about it in terms of data practices becoming central to shaping the terms and conditions of our participation in society, including how we come to understand the world, what services we are able to access, where we are able to go, what we are able to do, and the way we are governed. And there we see a little bit of mobility in there. And you can probably slowly start to see where this goes. And what is nice about the data justice work is that they've also really started to think, how can it be operationalized? How can it be used by developers? So for those of you who are interested, there's some nice work that came out there. But you can probably see we've got mobility justice, we've got data justice, and my thinking was really what is interesting happens at the intersection. So I did some work with Mimi Sheller, who, by the way, says hi to everyone at the workshop. She is also very intrigued to see what might come out of it. And we wrote this piece on mobility data justice that very much brings together these two different bodies of literature to come up with this concept. And this is really considering that being mobile increasingly involves the production, storage, and sharing of data, consciously or not, from car sensor data for diagnostics, insurance apps for driving, to ticketing apps for public transport, urban micromobility share schemes, Google Maps, fitness and well-being apps, Internet of Things sensors, air pollution data, you name it. And the datafication of mobility raises new questions with regards to justice. What kinds of inequalities emerge at the intersection of mobilities and datafication? Whose mobility gets included and excluded through data collection and sharing, and why and how? How are mobilities enabled and restricted through data? How are access and ownership to mobility and data changing? And what about the mobility of data itself in relation to justice? The concept of mobility data justice links scholarship, as I said earlier, on mobility justice and data justice, And this social justice lens helps us to understand the multiple ways power and inequalities are transformed or amplified at this intersection of mobility and data. And we kind of, for today, look at three elements of mobility data justice, because I think they might also be helpful for you to think through how the transport equity could link to some of this thinking. So this is distributive, procedural, and epistemic justice. So I'd like you to kind of think which elements of this might be maybe most productive for you to start thinking about how this social justice approach could be operationalized, quantified, or optimized for, or at least help us ask new questions about who counts and why. So let's start with distributive justice. So this kind of perspective really considers how mobility and data are accessed, accumulated, and distributed in equal or unequal ways. Also considers how data and mobility infrastructures lead to inequitable risks and benefit distribution, and how moral subjects are constituted with relation to mobility and data. What does that mean? Who is considered deserving or worthy of access to various mobility data or data mobilities? And who is targeted by data collection, surveillance, and control, for example, at borders? And a focus on the outcomes of inequalities at the intersection of data and mobility are part of this research agenda, as is the question of how new data mobility systems reinforce existing inequalities in distribution and access to the goods that they are supposed to offer. I think I leave it here for now. And I hope you may have some ideas when we come to the discussion later of how there could be links to your approaches. A procedural perspective really explores who gets to participate in the decision-making and the design of infrastructures that are relevant for the intersection of mobility and data, as well as its use. So this really involves thinking about the wide range of infrastructures that are relevant to mobility, data, justice, and injustice, but also the design, economic, and policy processes around them, and who gets to participate or not. And this extends to the role of public institutions, private companies, and governance processes in co-producing these mobility data justices or injustices. So what about the processes you are part of, the processes you design? Who gets to participate? Who is excluded, consciously or not? So it's really important to think how the how and why of decision-making, in addition to the who, is intrinsically bound up with data, algorithms, and increasingly AI. When AI is increasingly blackboxing how crucial decisions are reached and leaving people out of the loop to a greater extent than ever before, this undermines the very notion of procedural justice. So here we are also looking at how data is gathered, organized, and utilized in ways that shape social and spatial organization, including mobilities. It also considers the function of public space with its physical and virtual elements and the hybrid entanglements in producing, understanding, resisting, and challenging mobility data injustices. Now you're almost done with the conceptual stuff. We've got one more to go. And this is the epistemic perspective. And this is really to ask what counts as data and knowledge in relation to mobility, and how it is applied to knowing the world. So this includes considering the ways data systems are implicated in the production of intersectional immobilities and mobilities, including age, gender, race, sexuality, class, and disability. Lots of things we've already talked about yesterday. And epistemic perspectives examine how capabilities for mobilities are supported or prevented by users of data, and what other ways of knowing might be imaginable. For example, how justifications for the collection of data or applications of databases inadvertently surreptitiously or consciously limit mobilities and vice versa, or how the limitation or control of mobilities produces particular kinds of data subjects and objects with databases. Okay. Now we've kind of got a little bit of a base of the mobility data justice thinking. And I would like to see if you're still with me after quite a lot of social justice thinking for an early morning. So let's see if you're still with me. I want to see if we can use some of this social justice thinking to challenge some of our thinking around the transition to electric mobility. So, if you think about frontrunners of the electric mobility transition, what comes to mind for you? The Netherlands. Norway, I've got, yeah. Tesla, very good.
E-bikes. E-bikes.
E-bikes.
Why not?
Thank you.
It's a double transition.
China.
China. Good. I think we've covered most of the things I put on slides. Some of you might have thought about front-runner companies. That might be Tesla. That might be Chinese. Someone said Norway. So that's typically an example used of someone racing ahead in the e-mobility transition. California, also sometimes used. Thought I'd mention it since we're not too far away. To sum up, when thinking about frontrunners of the electric mobility transition, most people think of electric cars, some think of e-bikes, of fast uptake in the European Union and the US, and of American and Chinese manufacturers. Now let's see what a mobility justice answer to this question might look like. What are we looking at? We are looking at a photo my colleague van der Straten took in Bangladesh a couple of years ago. A photo of electric rickshaws. So it turns out most of the rickshaw fleet in Bangladesh and also some other countries in the area have almost entirely transitioned to electric over the last few years. Who knew? So this is a nice one to remember to ask colleagues. Which number do you think is higher? Might have given it away a little bit.
10%.
10%?
Wow.
So now we're asking, where are those electric mobility transitions happening? Or maybe, who's counting what and where?
But also, in China, there has been the tricycles in China have been electric for years, and I'm surprised that Bangladesh has more bikes than China. I
don't think Bangladesh has more bikes than China.
It's just more surprising.
I think China people kind of have on their mind. I've got some China slides, I didn't put them in today, but there's definitely also huge numbers of electric 2- and 3-wheelers in China. Yeah, thank you.
Do you have like any estimate on the amount of people they serve? Because definitely the left ones are personal vehicles, the right ones like...
That's a really good question. So here we have vehicles, but of course, all of them are used to transport goods and people. So the amount of people served by these vehicles is much, much higher. Very difficult to get data on this. I wonder why.
Sorry, just for clarification also, I don't know exactly where it's leading, but in France and... No, with regards to the question, in France and Japan, you have a huge amount of people being moved traditionally by electric trains. Much more than what can be put in rickshaws, right? I mean, these are tremendous amounts of people. So I would say that's been electric mobility on huge scales.
Absolutely.
So maybe for the social justice it's less important or so, or why did you not mention this part of electric mobility in this context? That's sort of my question.
Yeah, this is not the history talk. I do have a talk on what does electric mobility mean? It's not about cars, it's about all the things that have been electric for a long time, but people don't usually consider. But what I'm interested here is what is currently being considered as one of the main ways to get to lower transport carbon emissions.
Okay, so it's the disruption of the state of the art.
So everyone says electric cars, electric cars, electric cars.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's happening in the US and it's happening in Norway. I'm trying to say no. A good question.
The point is about what we're counting and what we're not counting, and those people are being counted already, and we're not counting the electric rickshaws in Bangladesh.
True. So you see the estimate, 1 to 4 million. There's quite a large margin of error in there. Never mind the amount of trips. Of course, there is some work around this, but I'm also using it to really make that point.
But if you talk about the numbers, you also have to relate it to the number of trips, as you said, or population. I mean, the population in Bangladesh is more than double the size of Germany, something like that. So, I mean, if we double this 678,000, we also
Not
have
that bad in
1.4 million, so the difference is not so high.
But I would love to see some of those calculations. We are missing those calculations. I always get asked these questions, and I'm not the calculating kind of person, so help. Okay, so why is this not on our radar? Because this happens in a kind of DIY approach. Let's order some electric motor from China. Let's have a homemade, homemade, not homemade, but from the local Bangladesh industry, they make lead acid batteries. Let's take one of those. Let's patch them together and convert the old rickshaws. They're electric. Let's hook them up illegally to the electricity grid. That suddenly goes, whoa, what is happening? Peaks happening all the time. Everyone doing something strange. Ooh, electric rickshaws. That's really evil. We've been trying to get rid of these old-fashioned rickshaws for a really long time. We've been banning them repeatedly because they're so old-fashioned. We want new technology. And now they are making our electricity grid go bad. Let's ban them some more. Bad stuff. But at the same time, there's a whole ecosystem emerging. The people who traditionally have facilitated parking and social opportunities for the riders are now also moving into providing charging. They are working together with solar companies to install solar panels on their roof, providing new opportunities for income. Kind of distributed grid emerging. All kinds of interesting things happening. No kind of Western institutions coming in to say, let's do electric mobility transition and this is how to do it. No government in Bangladesh saying this is our vision for electric mobility and that's what we want to do, because their vision is actually, let's install chargers for electric cars, because we've got 4 of them. So it's really interesting to see who is kind of considered and who is not. And then if all of these rickshaws and all of the people are not really leaving a trace in terms of data, or in very different ways to what we are using in our data sets, they're also not getting into things like mobility as a service analysis or training data for AI models that tell us something about the electric mobility transition. Who is involved in the governance of these kinds of processes, how AI becomes an important non-human actor in these governance processes. But modes such as rickshaws are not part of the picture. So here I want to kind of briefly bring it back to mobility data justice. So what does this case study tell us about distributive justice? It shows how specific types of electric mobility are associated data are accessed, accumulated, and distributed in unequal ways, including the registration of vehicles and associated inclusion on datasets, statistics, and models. It demonstrates how data and mobility infrastructures lead to inequitable risks and benefit distribution, with government grants for installing safe car chargers in well-off countries and government bans of rickshaws and their charging infrastructure leading to battery fire hazards. What about procedural justice? Who participates in the decision-making and the design of e-mobility infrastructure? Large companies and global north governments, or small workshops and global south institutions? This also extends to the roles these public institutions and private companies take on in the design process and the governance processes that co-produce mobility data justices. So this is really about the who, how, and why of decision-making around electric mobility and how it is intrinsically bound up with data, algorithms, and increasingly AI. And finally, in terms of epistemic justice, the electric rickshaw case study has opened up a debate about what counts as data and knowledge and respectable mobility. And at least I'm hoping the word electric mobility will now have different associations for most of you. This also concerns the way data systems are implicated in the production of intersectional mobilities. For example, how rickshaw hailing apps perpetuate income opportunities exclusively for male drivers, or become implicit in gender-based violence towards female customers. The epistemic perspective also allows us to examine how capabilities for mobilities are supported or prevented by uses of data. The absence of rickshaws in statistics due to their precarious legal status being a case in point, and how that might inform knowledge around e-mobility transitions and plans for their future. Now, I think we have time for a second case study to carry on challenging our notion of the electric mobility transition in terms of who counts and why and how. And this case study takes us to sub-Saharan Africa, and especially the electrification of motorbikes emerging there. And knowing my audience here, I've tried my very best to collect lots of data and numbers for this one. We'll get to that in a second. So in sub-Saharan Africa, there are many startup companies around the electrification of motorbikes and lots of investment with very fast emergence of an ecosystem. Here I'm using one of these companies as example, Spiro. It's an African e-bike and battery swapping startup that is now expanding to Kenya with the deployment of 1.2 million electric vehicles. The company was founded only in 2022 and already operates around 10,000 bikes in Benin, Togo, Rwanda, and Uganda. And the riders are offered around $340 for their old bikes, which is about a third of buying a new electric bike. Then they pay about $2 a day to pay off the outstanding balance, with the bike being GPS tracked in that time. And this subscription also gives drivers access to a network of battery swapping stations, with 3,000 of them being set up in Kenya. Now, I did smuggle in a tiny bit of history, because battery swapping for electric vehicles is of course not a new idea. Did you know that most taxis in New York City were electric at some point, served by battery swapping stations across the city? But back to Africa for now. Air quality is really bad. Riders and passengers suffer from congestion. Accidents and fatalities are really high. And the hope is that these transition to electric will help with some of these issues. And one way of financing happens through carbon credits. So this is interesting also how we have a global flow of finance, mobility, emissions going on. So carbon credits is a unit equivalent to the emissions of a ton of CO2, and it's aimed to get companies to reduce their emissions, and these credits are then linked to the development of projects that offset the company's environmental impact. Many people are quite critical about this. There was a big scandal recently in the press. But here it's just interesting to see how investment goes towards carbon neutral factories for the local production of e-motorbikes. And if investment into these companies are calculated as carbon offset for the global north, what are the social justice implications of avoiding a shift to automobility in African countries while switching our sports utility vehicle and urban sprawl-based car culture to electric cars in the global north. So I would say this is an example of this scalar approach of mobility data justice that involves thinking about the human scale, the motorbike rider, or the people going along with their apps, the city and the congestion and the national scale of legislation and transport regulations, cultures, infrastructures, and associated data, but then also the global scale with the flow of investments, pollution, and data kind of trying to offset things between one and the other around the flow of ideas, humans, vehicles, data. So how do we capture these multiple scales, these complex systems and their social justice implications in our work? Open question. But why does it matter so much? So here's the number bit coming up. We are doing a lot of work that is about the United States and about Europe. And I would like to say that there's so much happening in Africa that is so not on our agenda in terms of transport research. And it's really important to take in how much it matters to look there and to research there. This is a comparison between Africa and Europe. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the same nice graph for America, but that might be interesting to add to this one. So this is really about how many people we are talking about and how that's going to change into the future. And this is particularly happening in cities, where some of the kind of micro-mobilities we are talking about here in terms of motorbikes, rickshaws, other forms of light electric vehicles are especially powerful, and where we currently don't have a high motorization rate. So we could really make a difference there in avoiding our mistakes. At the same time, of course, very much on the front line of climate change. So the impact of us having driven around our cars and flying around the globe and all the rest of it is hitting really hard there. And what puts it even more into perspective is who has contributed most globally to CO2 emissions historically. The green bit, not surprising, is the US, and the yellow bit, Europe. And somewhere at the bottom, we see a very small blue bit. That's that whole big continent of Africa that we saw earlier. 3%. And this is vehicle ownership. So how many vehicles are registered per 1,000 people? Globally, on average, that's 180. In Kenya, 17, Nigeria, 25, Ethiopia, 2. I think it would be a good idea if that doesn't go to 180. But of the vehicle fleet that we already have, most of those vehicles, at least in some of those sub-Saharan African countries, are motorcycles. So we see a huge range here between Burkina Faso, 85%, to then, where do we have Rwanda, around 50%, and so on. This is a FIA Foundation report with some good data and some very flaky data for obvious reasons, because not all motorbikes are registered, etc., etc. And these are some projections that have been done also by the FIA Foundation around the number of 2- and 3-wheelers going up and different scenarios for that.
So this is a question out of ignorance, that I could imagine that different vehicle classes have different expected lifespans and sort of the rate of replenishment that would happen naturally. Is that the case? I mean,
Good question. How long do these survive? I know that the lifespan of vehicles is incredibly much longer than it is in the US or in Europe. There's lots of very interesting anthropological and historical scholarship on how cars and motorbikes get made and remade. But I don't have numbers, I'm afraid. And then there's some research by McKinsey, so even they are becoming interested. So I guess there's some money to be made. So this is about how many of these vehicles are going to become electric in the near future. And this includes two-wheelers, light commercial vehicles, minibuses, and passenger cars. And it gives us a nice indication of the difference in scale that we see there. So they're estimating that 45% of the sub-Saharan Africa overall vehicle fleet will be electric by 2040, and that motorbikes are a big part of that, the majority of that. But of course, these motorbikes are mainly used as a motorcycle taxi. So again, we have the question, this is not only about the vehicles, but this is how many trips they facilitate, both in terms of freight and in terms of people, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of enabling lots of businesses, both on the side of riding the motorbikes, but also using them to bring things to market, etc. And there's a huge amount of app use in the background to organize all of these things. Some of that happens through ride-hailing apps. Uber is also piling in with electric motorbikes, etc. But a lot of it is also very informal, WhatsApp messages, etc. So again, the data sets, really tricky. But also, people haven't really tried very hard, I think. So I'd be really interested to get some interesting data out of this. And of course, everything we've been looking at so far, the motorbikes, the rickshaws, many people would classify them as micromobility, along with the e-bikes we mentioned earlier, the cargo bikes, the electric scooters we see here on campus, etc. But I would also say that the discussions on micromobility and also light electric vehicles are often not really talking about electric motorbikes and electric rickshaws. So we also see a kind of distinction about what counts as micromobility and light electric vehicles, depending on in which country it happens and what doesn't. And why does this matter? Final numbers of the day. Because people like you build models. People like you estimate things. They demonstrate to policymakers why things matter and what should we do. So here we've got some work that has very much a Western perspective on how light electric vehicles could replace car trips. I would like to say we also need to know how can we avoid potential future car trips. It's not even part of the model. It's good we have seen a lot of work on the kind of stand-up e-scooters. It's really good we've seen quite a bit of work on e-bikes, last-mile delivery trips. All of that is really powerful. And we've seen those numbers used in a lot of justifications around regulation and policy making for future mobility. But where are the tools to calculate this for African cities, countries, or regions? Where's the data to feed these models? How do we even design them? How are today's case studies represented in training data sets for AI that we use? With these questions, I'd like to come to my conclusion. So, let's get to the final part of this talk. Maybe you picked up some fun facts you could try on colleagues. Did you know that Germany is way behind in the transition to electric mobility, while Bangladesh is one of the leaders? Did you know that in many sub-Saharan African countries, more than half of the vehicle fleet is made up of motorbikes? Well, I'm hoping beyond these fun facts, you may also remember some mobility and social justice elements, mobility data justice thinking. So what kind of mobility counts? Gets counted in the first place? Preconceptions of what electric mobility is and the importance of electric cars. Where electric mobility transitions are happening fastest. Preconceptions of where mobility research matters most. Where innovations and change happen, where we see growing cities and population with a historically low carbon footprint and motorization rates, with a rapidly changing climate and associated migration pressures. How many rickshaws are represented in data sets used for machine learning? What is the carbon footprint of the mobility of data and the data centers needed for app-based mobilities? How do taxi apps help enable more opportunities and safety for female motorbike riders? How can decentralized solar infrastructure enable communities to set up micromobility-enabled businesses? How can we design mobility systems that combine public transit and micromobilities to radically lower carbon emissions, while providing mobility to a growing number of people that are not part of car and flight-based lifestyles? Also, how can we learn from these Global South examples of electric mobility transitions that focus on micromobility rather than cars? Where freight and passenger transport are mixed up, how do you even label those things in your models? And light electric privately owned vehicles are also the majority of public transport? How does that work in your models? How would we model, design, and plan for these approaches? What would the social justice implications be? I'm hoping that in combining a micromobility and a social justice perspective, this talk provided some fresh thinking for you, for people involved in calculating, modeling, designing, optimizing the future of mobility. So I would like to invite you to think how this mobility data justice approach could link to your transport equity perspectives, to start thinking about how some of the social justice approaches could be operationalized, quantified, optimized, or maybe just help us ask new questions about who counts and why and where. Got some references and some more, and a big thank you for everyone.